So, first thing I ask every single person that I interview for a podcast is, can you please introduce yourself for everyone listening here today?
Sure. My name's Bobby Lockhart. I'm an educational game designer in Chicago, Illinois. I've been working in games for learning for over 10 years. And yeah, it's kind of my life mission, I guess. Um, yeah, I don't know. I haven't been picky about learning goals or audience. I
Okay.
just want to make games that help people realize their potential.
So you said life goal. So how did this kind of passion for you kind of start?
It's a weird story because people often ask like, "Oh, what video game made you really want to get into video games?" But for me, it was a book.
Okay.
It's the Diamond Age by Neil Stevenson. I can't recommend the book to everyone because there's some weird stuff in there. There's like an orgy computer where people swapping fluids is like an exchange of digital information.
Just to confirm, this is the book that got you into making learning games.
Yes,
Okay.
allow me to continue. So that's why I don't recommend the book, is that little subplot. But it's actually quite a minor part of the overall book, which is about a young girl who discovers by accident basically a video game that's in the form factor of a book called A Young Lady's Illustrated Primer. There's sort of a neo-Victorian sensibility going around in parts of this imagined future, and someone has built the ideal educational game, essentially this artifact that a child carries around with them. When it's not being used, it's surveilling their life and taking that data to figure out what it should teach them next, what information is going to be most relevant to them. And
Right.
then when they are using it, it creates a fully interactive story starring them and incorporating all of this educational material that it thinks they're going to need for their life. So yeah, you see this girl named Nell essentially being raised by this
That's really interesting.
educational game because she's sort of on her
So
own.
you kind of read this and were like, I kind of want to make my own version of this, or
Yeah, I was like, I don't know of anyone who's working towards this even.
hmm.
And and so I looked around, and there were a few other people who had a similar sort of inspiration. But as I learned more about the field, it became evident to me that it's kind of the wrong approach, that like building an omni game doesn't really make sense. And rather an equivalently impactful mission would be to just contribute towards an ecosystem of educational games with such breadth and depth that someone could basically self-select their way through an entire education that's game based.
Right.
And that's what my life's mission is, basically to cover enough of human knowledge with games based learning that someone who wants to learn that way could do it.
That's not a small little mission at all. That's
I'm
nothing, yeah.
that's why contributes to. It's just like I'm not putting too much pressure on myself to like, you know, oh, 90% of it is going to be games that I made, and then like other people can add 10. No, I'm gonna, do a tiny fraction of 1% of all the games that would be needed for something like that. But
I mean, it's quite a large move. I mean, like there are other people that are trying, but so I'm curious, like, what are some of the pieces that you have contributed to that process?
let's see. I've made games that teach about, well, quite a few games that teach programming of various sorts, because that's something that's sort of in vogue, I would say.
Yeah.
The value of it is demonstrated, and also the like there's a cynical economic value proposition that people find easy to sell to municipalities and things. Um, uh, so I've done those for kids as young as 6 and up to teenagers.
Mhm.
And then I've made games that teach lots of wacky stuff. There's like things about the scientific method and math. STEM is kind of I would say lower hanging fruit in terms of learning games, because you can there's a definite answer that doesn't have to be judged by another human essentially. So you can make single player games that make sense in that area. But I've also made games about things like I don't know, I made a game called Paw and Order Furry Victims Unit, which was in collaboration with the Chicago Humane Society, which teaches about basically forensic investigation of crimes against animals.
That's so specific. That's
It's something that they actually do, and they had a sort of after school course on this material. And so we got a grant and brought together some middle schoolers to like make an interactive narrative about this, and then turned it into a point and click adventure game.
that's so interesting. So I guess I'm kind of curious because I mean your goal is to kind of create this whole swath of games, right, that kind of cover all the subjects, but not all subjects, and you're kind of hinting at this, not all subjects are the ones that will make you money. Like making a game for every like some sell more than others, right? The Steams, the maths, they're more likely to be understood by the average person who might buy these things. And so how are you kind of negotiating the challenges of like making a living and kind of making games that address all the things you want them to address?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm kind of going with the flow for now, and partly sort of hoping that well, one of the first big projects I worked on, and probably still the biggest project I've worked on, although the one I'm engaged in now is quite huge. I made an independent game called Codemancer, and that was entirely self-motivated. I launched it on Kickstarter and built it with a bunch of contractors and friends. And that was a game that teaches programming to very young kids, because at the time that was a space that was not so saturated as it is now. But I would like to do more self-motivated indie educational games along those lines. And I feel like if you can make a passionate argument for those, it doesn't have to be as economically motivated as something like a game that you'd build with a large team, like the one I'm doing now. I'm making yet another game that teaches programming, this time on the Roblox platform. And so like there's a lot of people that want that to happen, and we need a pretty large team to make it happen. And so you need to have that sort of surefire economic incentive lined up. But if you're making a little indie game, it's not as critical. And I definitely have one on deck. I've been making concepts for a game about music theory, which is obviously not something that the school systems, for example, are really motivated to make sure every child has a background in. But I think it's a valuable thing to know about. And
Well, and so I mean, I've asked a lot of other people this, but I'd love to hear your kind of take on. Are you happy with kind of the other products you're seeing out there? Like when we're talking about like learning games, educational games. I mean, I'm calling this event the Bad Game Arcade to kind of poke fun at some of the challenges we have. But are you kind of happy with what you're seeing when you're looking at the industry as it currently stands and kind of the options that are out there? Are you seeing like some very significant gaps?
well, in terms of learning goals, there's certainly a lot of gaps. And it's partly pragmatic. It's like it's really tough to think of a game that makes it very urgent for the player to know about French medieval literature. and like you could imagine that. I'm sure right now your gears are spinning and you're like, I can make a game that makes
We
it.
actually have one in the space about the English language creation, and it talks about medieval English literature. So I'm kind of seeing it already, is all I'm saying.
Yeah. But I don't know. It takes a little bit more of a stretch than to know about, like, say, orbital mechanics. Like that immediately is, oh, I get it. That's a video game. Orbital mechanics. It's easy. uh, so it's early days yet, and I think we'll get to all of those nooks and crannies.
Yeah.
And then in terms of like the quality of work, I think it's the standard power law distribution, just like every field of cultural creation. There's a few really great things being made all the time, and then some medium stuff, and then a whole lot of garbage.
So what separates the great from the medium to the garbage when it comes to educational games?
Well, I think I have to defer to people like Jim G on that stuff. I was very pleased to have been part of, not this past year, but the previous year. There's a G Learning Game Awards through UW Madison, and so like I was a contestant the very first year of it. I was a judge the second year, and now we've had the third year.
Very
But
cool.
the rubric for how they judge these games is very much based on the theories that he puts out in his book. What video games have to teach us about learning and literacy.
Okay, I mean, I think that's a fair point to kind of put in there. I mean, I feel like I need to go back to the book now, and I want to get up I want to pull up that rubric for myself in the future. And so we're kind of running kind of short in terms of time that's kind of left. And given what we've talked about so far, I have like one kind of burning question about what you're talking about. And like when I look at educational games and like what's out there, there's a lot of games about math. Like
Yes.
there's a lot of and I'm not saying they're good games. I'm just saying they're out there and they're about math. And so do you think like we will or we have reached a saturation point for games for certain subjects, and like maybe it's time we move to other subjects? And or the opposite question, can we ever have enough?
Yeah, I mean, I feel it's maybe by analogy, it's like, are there enough video games about zombies or books about romance or something? Like like there's lots of them. I think there's still room for more, but at the same time, yeah, new ones tend to be retreading of old ground and boring. So like I wouldn't discourage people from making new learning games about math topics, especially if you can find a new angle that's going to connect with a new kid that wouldn't have been
Right.
able to connect with that material a different way. But yeah, if you can get to a more esoteric subject, if you can like find funding to make a game about music theory or medieval literature, you should do that instead.
Yeah, and I mean to kind of wrap up that with one last kind of final, and maybe this I wouldn't say this is an easy question, but like it's something that I've come across in the work that I'm doing, where I'm looking at very like abstract and sometimes very sensitive issues. Like, are there topics we shouldn't game?
I've thought about that. I think there are definitely some types of learning that are better done in other modes. Like it's better to read about them or to do a project or to, but I don't think that means that we shouldn't have video games about those topics. It's okay to have some bad games in some areas. I think it's like something is better than nothing.
Right.
And that's That's a lot of the evidence people will give you for their games, is like, we compared it to nothing and it's way better. And I think that's like, there's some validity to that. Like, you know, some people don't have access to other ways of learning, and digital distribution is just so easy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and you're correct in the sense of like having a game sometimes is better than not having the game, because at least there's a different way that someone can come across that material. And so
Mhm.
I think that's a really nice way to kind of think about that, because I think that question of like, can we game every subject, does have kind of a convoluted answer when you talk about like what do the subjects look like and what angles are we talking about, because like, let's be real, no one wants to see a racism simulator made. Like no one wants to see that game made, right? Like, and so there's a lot of questions that come up there. So I know that we'll be talking about some of these themes a bit more tonight. Well, you'll be talking about them. I'll be listening in the panel that's happening this evening. So I'm not gonna hold you here any longer. But thank you for taking the time to talk.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you for
I
being here. And
can't
I
wait
mean, I'll
to
see you in
see you
an
later.
hour again.
Yeah.
So thanks so much.
Thank you.